Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm John Harney. I come to you today from the sunny environs of my house, and I want to talk about a game called Crimson Desert. At the time of recording, Crimson Desert just came out. It is developed by Pearl Abyss, South Korean developers who also made a very successful MMO called Black Desert. And Crimson Desert was initially a prequel, and it was associated with the MMO, and now it's kind of standalone, but in the same universe. It's a little unclear to me, but what I want to talk about today is how a South Korean developer is depicting Western ideas and Western tropes. And this is something I think about a lot, and it's something I teach about a lot, but it's usually in the opposite direction, which is I'm talking to students about, and I'm writing or trying to write about how the West is creating a version of Asia, like, for itself. And this is particularly important in video games because video games can be a very strong example of this. And in addition to a kind of a Western creation of Asia, you do get these kind of Asian creations of Asia that sometimes are independent and sometimes are heavily influenced by the West and sometimes do a kind of a third, more interesting thing that I might talk about in a few minutes. So what inspired me to talk about Crimson Desert this week was really the first couple hours of the game. It is it's an open world, very kind of theoretically structureless game, or at least a game where you can fiddle around with the structure, but in the first few hours, you're very much kind of the member of this clan, and everybody has British Isles accents. And so it's this very kind of Celtic kind of thing. And so for me, playing the game in these first few hours was kind of amusing, originally being Irish myself, and trying to kind of figure out where this kind of an idea sits.
There you are. Perfect timing as always. Sit down, dig in.
We're still missing Ryan. Probably dead.
Everyone got a bowl? Yeah?
I suppose that's one less mouth to feed, eh?
Oi, could make it two less mouths, you know.
Crimson Desert, more broadly, is in high fantasy, which at this point is kind of a sprawling term, but to a large extent probably goes back to Tolkien, kind of at the root of it, or at least kind of, an important interlocutor in that kind of idea in the early 20th century. And so high fantasy doesn't have to have elves, for example, but they tend to kind of show up, or in the case of Black Desert, there's kind of goblins rambling around, and there's, different species of humanoids that are just kind of part of the world. And so in that sense, one could argue that Crimson Desert participates in this kind of global idea of high fantasy, although that kind of has this Western assumption at the center of it. So I'm playing Crimson Desert, and I'm kind of amused by the accents, and there's Scottish accents, and the odd Irish accent, and these kind of English accents. And because I'm a nerd, I'm like, okay, so who are these people? They're situated, I guess, like a pre-Norman, Anglo-Saxon kind of thing. I don't love that's getting roped in with the Irish, for example, but it kind of is what it is. And then you take an extra beat and you look at what's happening in the game, and they have this kind of the blue paint markings on their face, which is very reminiscent of the Horizon games on the PlayStation, which themselves kind of create this kind of Celtic idea, this kind of, tribal, prehistoric, or at the very least pre-civilization or something, pre-early modern perhaps, kind of way of looking at society. And so Crimson Desert's not necessarily doing anything, right or wrong or different in that respect. But playing it, it just feels a little off. It feels a little strange, and the accents are kind of being positioned in a way that is kind of not quite right to me. And so I'm playing the game and I'm thinking, is this what it's like to be Japanese and play like Ghost of Tsushima or something like that? Or is this what it's like to be someone playing this game that depicts the history of your country, and it's made by these people who are interested in that concept, but they're not quite getting things right? And that's kind of what I feel Crimson Desert is doing. And there's nothing wrong with it. For one thing, I'm kind of excited, and it's interesting to me that more Asian developers are kind of getting into this kind of thing. There's a lot of games made in East Asia about East Asian topics, obviously, but high fantasy does seem to be an area where you're going to see, or we are already seeing, and we are going to see Asian developers come in and kind of fiddle around with it. And I think part of the reason that's doable, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's become something of a kind of a global kind of an idea, and it mixes things anyway. It's already kind of mixing things. And of course, we're already doing it. Like I mentioned, the Horizon Zero Dawn games. There's lots of examples in Western-made games of kind of taking our own history of the West, which is a very broad idea anyway, and trying to kind of mix things up and mash it up. And the idea of kind of, pre-Norman Anglo-Saxon or something has already been kind of explored, and not just in video games. I mean, in the Game of Thrones TV shows, the Snow family and all those people from the north sound like they're from the north of England, like largely Yorkshire and that kind of area, right? Like, I mean, Sean Bean is from Sheffield, for example. But
break out the ale. These men are thirsty. I said that a lot, actually, up in Sheffield. Is it Game of Thrones?
But it kind of works for a British audience, but certain as well for an American audience, that those accents sound earthy in some kind of a way. And so obviously to the South Korean developers, there's something similar going on there, or with whatever creative partners they brought in to kind of work on some of that stuff. So for me, you know, Crimson Desert's getting a lot of attention because of its mechanics, and it's a bit of a weird game. I like it personally. There's lots of takes on the internet. Go find them, go read them. And there's people who like it but say it's kind of strange and it has lots of peccadillos, and there's people who are turned off by that. But I'm just kind of intrigued, and I want to kind of learn more about this world, and I want to kind of go through the open world and find more kind of characters and see if this kind of idea persists. I know that in the MMO, for example, there are these kind of two broader kingdoms. But again, in the MMO, you're largely talking about white or white adjacent characters. That's kind of another kind of a question. Like, I think some people watching might kind of say, well, Asian games are always depicting white people or Westerners. Look at the Final Fantasy games. But no, I would say the Final Fantasy games actually don't do that. And that probably is worth another kind of video on its own.
Stamp scared to bite the hand that fed him? Or is he a loyal little doggy?
A counterpoint that I do really think is interesting, and it's not just an excuse to talk about my favorite game, is the Dark Souls series. And I think Dark Souls is a completely different approach to this kind of an idea. So for those of you who might not be familiar, you might just know Dark Souls is a very difficult game. The Dark Souls games are set in this extremely kind of grim and dark, but I wouldn't say grimdark, setting where if effectively we're kind of doomed. It's kind of this millenarian kind of descent into the abyss kind of overall setting. But most of the characters have very kind of Western style armor, kind of a medieval romantic period kind of armor. The dragons often look like Western dragons, though not always. And of course there's lots of dragons. Sometimes they look like Western dragons, but they kind of act a bit more like Eastern dragons. And in both the East and the West, there's lots of traditions of dragons being kind of wise or being actors in the history and things like that. But whereas Crimson Desert, I think, is kind of playing around in this existing kind of sandbox where Celtic people it's kind of a way to talk about basic or pre-civilization Europeans or something like that. And then in Crimson Desert, before too long, you're in cities and you're dealing with nobles and all this stuff. So it's this very vague, somewhat Eurocentric kind of idea of a high fantasy world. And Dark Souls is super interesting because at first blush, it seems like there's some certain visual aesthetics and choices, the architecture of the buildings you're walking around, the choice of weapons, things like that, that just really feels, oh, well, this is kind of out of European medieval history kind of an idea, but it does something totally different. So I think that's kind of an intriguing idea. I think Crimson Desert is worth looking at to kind of have that experience I'm talking about. Maybe you won't feel it, but I certainly do. This kind of sense like, this is fine and it's fun. It just feels a little off, and it maybe one could argue that is matched in those kind of MMO style mechanics versus something like Dark Souls, for example, which does this entirely kind of new thing, on its own. And so, I'd recommend both. You should play Dark Souls, and I should probably make a video about Dark Souls in the near future because, I think the internet could do with more Dark Souls videos, don't you? So, yeah, that was my kind of quick take this week about Crimson Desert. I'm hoping to play more. Maybe I'll come back and talk about it some more. Some other games I'd like to do soon. I've been playing a bunch of Marathon, and I'm always intrigued by how historical ideas and legacy show up in science fiction. And so I might come back and talk about Marathon soon. And from there, we'll see what the next couple of weeks bring. Thanks for watching.